Imagine a legal system where violence is just strictly outlawed for everyone. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
Right. The catch is the 5 richest families in town wrote this ironclad clause that basically lets them veto their own arrest warrants.
Which sounds completely absurd.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the premise of some dystopian novel, but according to the geopolitical analysis we are unpacking today, that is exactly how international law has operated since 1945.
It really is.
So the question for you, the listener, is why do the world's most powerful nations routinely cross borders or topple governments and just shatter global norms without facing any real consequences? Is it simply about, having the biggest economy and the most aircraft carriers, or is the system itself fundamentally rigged by design?
That's the million-dollar question.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring this incredibly dense, fascinating exchange of analytical notes that tries to answer exactly that. We're looking at the history of great power impunity and some starkly contrasting models of global dominance.
And I have to say, it is a profound set of documents. Our goal today is really to look past those daily sensationalized headlines we all see and uncover the structural, almost architectural patterns beneath half a century of global events.
Yeah, and before we jump into those patterns, I really need to share a mandatory disclaimer with you, because today's source material contains some highly politically charged claims and very, very specific historical interpretations regarding U.S. foreign policy, international law, and the actions of rival global powers like China and Russia.
Right, heavy stuff.
It is. So it's crucial to state right up front that neither of us are taking sides or endorsing these political viewpoints. Our mission in this deep dive is strictly to impartially unpack and analyze the ideas, the frameworks, and the arguments presented in the original text. We're just here to break down the mechanics of what these notes are arguing, nothing more.
That framing is essential.
Yeah.
Because we are really just analyzing the anatomy of geopolitical power as the authors have mapped it out and evaluating the historical causality they present.
Okay, let's unpack this. The documents start by tracing what they call an unbroken blueprint of regime removal. And it stretches all the way from the 1950s right up to the 2020s.
Yeah, it's a long timeline.
And the inciting incident they focus on is the 1954 overthrow of Jacobo Árbenz. He was the democratically elected president of Guatemala. And, I mean, the details of how this happened are just staggering.
They really are.
Because this wasn't just some military decision in a vacuum. It was essentially a corporate maneuver. You had the United Fruit Company, which was this massive American corporation that basically owned Guatemala's ports, its railroads, and just these huge tracts of unused land.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
Right. And when Árbenz tried to buy back that unused land to give it to the peasants, United Fruit essentially mobilized the American government.
And the mechanics of that mobilization are exactly what make it a blueprint. Because the company actually hired Edward Bernays, who is widely considered the father of public relations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Bernays didn't just, write press releases. He fabricated an entirely alternate reality. He set up these independent-sounding news bureaus and literally flew in American journalists, strictly controlling their itineraries.
Just managing exactly what they saw.
Exactly. He planted a completely manufactured narrative about a quote-unquote Russian communist beachhead in Guatemala. He engineered a panic just to justify an invasion.
And the most glaring part of all this is the sheer conflict of interest at the very top of the U.S. government. I mean, you have the Dulles brothers.
Right, Alan and John Foster.
Yeah, Alan Dulles is the head of the CIA, orchestrating the covert coup. And John Foster Dulles is the Secretary of State, managing the diplomacy side. But prior to this, both of them were senior partners at Sullivan and Cromwell.
Which is just incredible.
It's the exact law firm that represented the United Fruit Company. So they had these deep personal financial entanglements with the corporation that was demanding the coup. I mean, think of this like a corporate hostile takeover. But instead of buying shares, the executives are using a nation's military and intelligence apparatus to eliminate a business rival.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. And the analysis links that 1954 Guatemala playbook directly to Iran in 1953, an intervention known as Operation TPAJ.
Right, with a Mossadegh.
Yes. Again, you have a democratically elected leader, Prime Minister Mossadegh. He decides to nationalize his country's oil industry, which obviously threatened British and American corporate interests. So rather than sending in a massive overt military force, the CIA and British intelligence just went covert.
They operated in the shadows.
Exactly. They bankrolled artificial street protests, they bribed local journalists to run anti-Mossadegh propaganda, and they literally paid street gangs to create chaos. They engineered the collapse of the government from the inside.
It's the exact same formula, just fabricated pretexts leading to regime change. And this analysis draws a continuous, unbroken line from those early Cold War covert actions through a really long series of military maneuvers. You see the pattern evolve, right? Through the Gulf of Tonkin incident escalating the Vietnam War.
Yeah, the weapons of mass destruction narrative justifying the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
The decades in Afghanistan, the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia, just on and on.
Which eventually brings the timeline to the startling events described in the material regarding January 3, 2026 in Venezuela.
Right. And this is wild. The text details a massive kinetic U.S. strike on Caracas, resulting in the kidnapping of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores.
To face narco-terrorism charges.
Yeah. According to the notes, they're forcibly flown to New York, and Russia condemns the action as outright armed aggression. The text even notes that within the U.S. Senate, the operation is openly called illegal. When you look at this through line, from Guatemala to Caracas, it operates exactly like that corporate hostile takeover I mentioned.
It does. But the corporate hostile takeover analogy captures the aggression perfectly, with one critical difference.
What's that?
In the corporate world, there is a Securities and Exchange Commission to arrest you if you violate the law. Here, as the notes emphasize, you have to recognize the differing mechanisms of intervention because there is no global SEC.
Oh, right.
Guatemala and Iran were covert coups built on fabricated PR. Iraq was a massive overt military invasion resting on false intelligence. But then you look at the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia in 1999.
Which didn't have UN approval.
Exactly. It was completely unauthorized by the UN Security Council, yet many international lawyers argued it was, quote, illegal but legitimate on humanitarian grounds to stop ethnic cleansing. So if you just flatten all these events into one generic category of bad acts, you really miss how superpowers adapt their justifications to bypass the law.
Wait, that brings up the absolute core of this issue. If these interventions are happening right out in the open or, the covert ones are becoming public knowledge shortly after they happen, how is this possible without legal consequences?
That's the real issue.
Right. I mean, we have the United Nations. We have this entire framework of international law built out of the ashes of World War II specifically to prevent cross-border aggression. So what does this all mean? Are the notes suggesting the UN Charter is just a decorative piece of paper for the superpowers?
This raises an important question, and it goes much deeper than that. The analysis asks whether this immunity simply comes from America having a massive post-World War II economy. And the answer is no.
It's not just about money.
No, the immunity is structural. It was built directly into the DNA of the UN Charter at the San Francisco Conference in 1945. Think of it as the founding compromise or the San Francisco Compromise.
Because the U.S. and the Soviet Union flatly refused to join a global body that could dictate their foreign policy, right? They essentially held the creation of the UN for ransom.
That is a historical reality, yes. I
Yeah.
mean, the League of Nations failed largely because the United States never joined. So to ensure the new United Nations actually had the world's heavyweights at the table, the architects had to grant a structural exemption.
Right.
Inside the UN Charter, you have Article 2, Paragraph 4. This is the universal rule that prohibits the use of force. It is the global speed limit. Nobody can attack anybody.
But then you have Article 27.
Exactly. Article 27 grants the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the U.S., UK, France, Russia, and China, an absolute veto over any enforcement of those rules. They wrote the universal speed limit, but they legally handed themselves the only get-out-of-jail-free cards.
And the analysis highlights a specific historical moment that perfectly illustrates this mechanism. They frame it as a quote-unquote controlled experiment in international law. It's the 1986 International Court of Justice case, Nicaragua v. United States.
That's a textbook example.
Because the U.S. had actively mined Nicaragua's harbors and was arming the Contra rebels to destabilize the government. And Nicaragua actually took the U.S. to the International Court. And the court did its job. They ruled against the United States. They ordered reparations. So on paper, the law worked perfectly.
Adjudication succeeded, yes, but enforcement failed by design. When that ruling came down, the United States didn't panic.
They just ignored it.
Pretty much. They simply withdrew their consent to the court's compulsory jurisdiction, turned around, and used their Article 27 veto power at the UN Security Council to block any enforcement mechanism. They paid zero reparations. They basically just opted out of the consequences.
I mean, it is genuinely astounding to realize that the system isn't broken. It's operating exactly as intended.
And the material makes a really strong point to emphasize that this immunity is not exclusively an American phenomenon.
No, it's global.
Right, it's a great power feature. It is symmetrical. The Soviet Union utilized the exact same structural veto power to shield itself from global consequences when it rolled tanks into Hungary in 1956, and when it crushed the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and when it invaded Afghanistan in 1979.
And obviously, Russia does the exact same thing today.
Precisely. As the text explicitly notes, Russia utilizes that very same structural shield today regarding its actions in Ukraine.
Okay, but this raises a huge psychological question for me. If the system is so efficiently rigged that the P5 nations can just veto any punishment, why do they bother lying?
What do you mean?
Well, why did Edward Bernays need to invent a fake Russian beachhead in Guatemala? Why stage the Gulf of Tonkin? Why spend months arguing about WMDs in Iraq or narco-terrorism in Venezuela? If you are structurally immune from the police, why not just look the world in the eye and say, we're doing this because we want to and you can't stop us?
What's fascinating here is that it's a paradox, and it gets at the very nature of global norms. The analysis argues that the fact these superpowers feel compelled to spend millions of dollars fabricating pretexts is actually the strongest evidence that the core norm of the UN Charter still works on some level.
Like it has psychological power.
Exactly. The idea that unprovoked aggression is fundamentally illegitimate still holds immense psychological and diplomatic power.
Oh, I see. Hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue.
That is the exact quote the text uses. If these global powers truly felt zero constraint, they wouldn't bother with the elaborate theatrical lies. The norm against aggression survives intact in the minds of the global public. It's merely the hard enforcement mechanism that is missing.
So it's like keeping the receipts for a defective product when you know the store manager is also the chief of police.
That's a great way to put it.
You know you aren't going to get a refund today. Going to the authorities is useless because the authorities are the ones who sold you the broken product in the first place. But you don't throw the receipts away. You carefully file them in a drawer for the day that manager retires, or a bigger corporate franchise buys out the town. You are meticulously building a paper trail.
And that paper trail is what the analysis calls the Atlas Framework, or the co-financing liability doctrine. The theory here is that the international community, historians, and legal scholars must meticulously compute the principle and interest of these historical wrongs.
Not to get paid right now.
Right. You don't do this because you have the military or economic power to force the U.S. or Russia to cut a reparations check tomorrow. You do it to ensure a factual, unassailable record exists. The underlying philosophy here is captured in a brilliant phrase from the notes. They say, narrative precedes power, but documentation outlasts it.
Documentation outlasts it. That is powerful. And the notes actually point out that partial accountability does eventually happen, even if it is agonizingly delayed.
It just takes time.
Yeah. They bring up the 1970s Church Committee investigations in the U.S. Senate, which forced massive declassification and exposed decades of CIA abuses to the American public.
Yeah.
And they also highlight President Bill Clinton traveling to Guatemala City in 1999 and formally expressing regret for the U.S. role in the 1954 coup. I mean, it's highly symbolic. It obviously doesn't bring back the victims or repair a devastated economy, but it proves that keeping the ledger matters. Internal democratic pressure, fueled by undeniable documentation, eventually forces a societal reckoning.
Because accountability for great power crimes rarely happens in real time. It usually only arrives when power shifts massively. For instance, the Nuremberg trials were only possible because of the total military defeat of Nazi Germany.
Oh, right.
Or when internal documentation forces a society to confront its own history decades later. Maintaining that Atlas ledger is really the only long-term tool against permanent historical impunity.
So, if the UN was built to give superpowers a structural free pass for military expansion, it raises a really fascinating question. Does a nation have to use this violent, interventionist playbook to become a global superpower? Can you reach the top without the covert coups and the invasions?
It's a huge debate.
Right. And that brings us to the pivot in the source material. Like, authors look at a rival global power that seems to have ascended using a completely different strategy, which is China.
And the empirical contrast presented in the text is incredibly stark. It genuinely puzzles traditional students of geopolitics who, were raised on the absolute assumption that becoming a global hegemon requires massive forward-deployed military force.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The numbers they provide are wild. The United States currently maintains roughly 750 to 800 overseas military installations around the globe.
Which is a staggering footprint.
It's huge. But China officially maintains exactly one. A single naval facility in Djibouti, established in 2017, alongside, a few contested dual-use commercial port facilities.
The one.
Yeah. Furthermore, the text notes that China hasn't fought an expeditionary war since its brief border conflict with Vietnam in 1979. We are talking about nearly half a century where China evolved into the world's second largest economy without relying on regime change or global military projection.
Because their ascent ran through an entirely different mechanism. Instead of the military intelligence apparatus, they utilized manufacturing, global trade dominance, massive infrastructure projects, and what the source calls patient capital.
Okay, let's define patient capital for a second, because I think it's key here. We're talking about state-backed investments and infrastructure loans spanning decades, right? Building roads, ports, and telecom networks in developing nations without demanding the immediate quarterly returns or the forced political restructuring that usually comes with Western loans.
Yes, it is long-term economic integration rather than short-term political coercion. And this reality completely shatters the historical assumption that a great power must rely on gunboats, regime change, and 800 military bases to climb to the top of the global order.
The factual contrast in base numbers is really solid, but where the text gets really deep is debating why China took this path. Does a lack of expeditionary warfare mean China operates on a fundamentally different, higher moral plane than the US or Russia?
That's where things get philosophically complicated.
Right, because the notes introduce a concept heavily debated by the author's students. It's the idea that China's rise is a quote-unquote conscience-based economy, which is rooted in the philosophy of a 16th century Chinese scholar named Wang Yangming.
This is a complex philosophical framework. The concept is liangzi, which translates roughly to innate moral knowing or conscience. Wang Yangming posited that true knowledge and moral action are inseparable. You cannot know what is right without acting upon it.
Okay.
So the argument being presented is that China's modern avoidance of kinetic warfare and regime change is an active moral alignment of the state's actions with this deep civilizational desire for universal harmony.
Though there is a heavy debate in the notes about what to even call this modern application of liangji, the author pushes back hard against the term economocracy.
Yes, they do.
They argue that morphologically, economocracy sounds too much like rule by the economy, which just gives off the vibe of the very Wall Street plutocracy they are trying to criticize. It sort of strips away the moral weight they are trying to convey.
The terminology is hotly contested because the underlying claim is massive. I mean, if you assert that a superpower's rise is driven by a profound, innate civilizational conscience rather than standard geopolitical strategy, you're going to face immediate, severe pushback.
Oh.
And the source material itself provides that counterargument, noting that a contrast in behavior does not automatically establish a contrast in moral conscience.
Right, and I have to challenge the morality claim here, too. Think about it this way. If a smaller guy deliberately avoids getting into a bar fight with the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, is he a pacifist operating on a higher moral conscience? Or does he just know how to count?
That's a very practical way to look at it.
If you're peaceful primarily because you lack the naval capability to win a global conflict against a country with 800 military bases, is that morality or is it just math?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the historical record really supports that skepticism. The sources point directly to the famous doctrine established by former Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, which is hide your strength, bide your time.
Right.
That is explicitly a doctrine of cold, strategic calculation and immense patience. It is about self-preservation and economic development, not necessarily an outpouring of innate moral goodness.
And the sources don't let Beijing off the hook either. They clearly document that when China's capabilities have matured over the last decade, they absolutely have used coercion.
Oh, without a doubt.
The text lists the militarization of artificial island features in the South China Sea in direct defiance of international tribunal rulings. It brings up the lethal Galwan Valley border clash with India. It details the severe use of economic punishment, like boycotts and trade embargoes against countries like Australia and Lithuania over political disputes, and of course the escalating military pressures surrounding Taiwan.
Which leads the author of the notes to a crucial synthesis. Claiming that China's restraint flows purely from a conscience-based civilization is doing far more work than the empirical evidence can actually carry.
Yeah, the facts don't fully support the theory.
Right. The safer, intellectually rigorous claim is that Chinese strategic culture, which is certainly influenced by philosophies like Wang Yangming, but is equally shaped by the historical trauma of the century of humiliation and by hardline strategic calculation, has so far produced a rise without expeditionary war.
So we shouldn't view this concept of liangzi, this conscience, as a literal, factual description of how Beijing makes decisions in the Situation Room today.
No, you really shouldn't. The text argues that liangzi is much better viewed as an aspiration. It is a vital civilizational resource, a philosophical standard against which state conduct can and should be constantly measured.
Oh, that makes sense.
Because if the international community is going to build a framework of accountability like that Atlas ledger of historical receipts we discussed earlier, it has to point in all directions symmetrically. You cannot just tally the historical wrongs of the United States in Guatemala or Iraq and give a free pass to the coercive actions of China or Russia. Total, genuine accountability requires judging every superpower by the exact same structural metrics.
This has been a heavy but incredibly necessary exploration. We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the unbroken blueprint of covert intervention and regime change, tracing the through line from the United Fruit Company in 1954 Guatemala to the stunning accounts of Caracas in 2026. We unpacked the San Francisco Compromise, revealing how the UN Charter was literally held for ransom to offer universal laws with selective enforcement, giving superpowers a structural veto.
The ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. We broke down the Atlas framework and why keeping the receipts documenting history, even when justice is decades delayed, is so vital to shifting global norms. And finally, we looked at the massive contrast between the U.S.'s 800 military bases and China's strategy of patient capital, questioning whether peace through strategic calculation is the same thing as a conscience-based economy. For you, the listener, the core takeaway here is that critical thinking is absolutely essential when you are looking at global news. Every intervention, every military strike, every economic sanction comes wrapped in a carefully fabricated PR narrative. Understanding the hidden architecture of global power, how the system was built, who wrote the loopholes, and who it protects helps you see right through those pretexts.
I think there's one final vital question we should leave you with today. It builds right on the observation that documentation outlasts power. If that is true, and these Atlas ledgers are constantly being updated in real time by historians, by citizen journalists, and by economic analysts, what covert actions, what unacknowledged economic coercions happening in the shadows today are currently being meticulously documented?
That's a great question.
What receipts are being filed away in a drawer right now, just waiting for the geopolitical winds to shift, ready to collapse the immunity of tomorrow's superpowers?
That is a chilling thought, because eventually the franchise always changes hands. The system may be rigged by design to protect the biggest economies today, but the ledger remembers everything. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, and we'll catch you next time.